You are not lost. You know exactly who you are. Or rather, you know the story you have been telling about who you are, the version you have been refining for years, the one that mentions your wounds at precisely the right moment, that carries your values like a lantern, that has learned, with considerable practice, to distinguish itself from the hollow performance of everyone else around you. You have done the work, the journals, the retreats, the long conversations at midnight about what you actually want, what you actually feel, who you actually are beneath all the conditioning. And still, there is something. You can feel it in the hour before sleep, in the stillness between tasks, in the way a stranger's life glimpsed through a train window can hollow you out in 3 seconds flat. Something unlived, something sealed behind glass, a life that belongs to you, and that you have never once inhabited. You have named this feeling 100 ways. Regret, yearning, the road not taken, the self not yet born. Every name is a consolation. None of them are accurate. Because what lives behind that glass is not a truer version of you waiting to be claimed. It is the evidence of everything the self you are so carefully protecting has refused to become. This is not a wound from the outside. It is architecture. The unlived life is not what happened to you. It is what you built, brick by brick, to avoid a specific terror. And that terror has a name, and the name is not failure, and it is not inadequacy. The name is the self, the actual, annihilating, non-negotiable wholeness that lies beneath every story you have ever told about who you are. And your ego has been running from it, dressed in the language of authenticity, for your entire adult life. Carl Jung, in Aion, his most architecturally demanding work, drew a distinction that the entire self-help industry has spent 70 years carefully obscuring. He separated the ego from the self. The ego, the I you wake up with, the narrator of your inner life, the agent who chose this career and carries these opinions and knows, with exhausting precision, the particular texture of your suffering, is not the center of the psyche. It is a complex, a remarkably well-organized, extraordinarily persuasive complex, but a complex nonetheless. A node of consciousness floating in an ocean it did not create and cannot ultimately control. The self, what Jung described in Aion as the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, the archetype of wholeness, is not the ego's achievement. It is the ego's sovereign. And this is where the modern authenticity project makes its catastrophic error. When the culture, the therapy culture, the wellness culture, the podcast culture, tells you to find your authentic self, to strip away the conditioning, to live your truth, it is addressing the ego and pretending it is addressing the soul. It is handing you a more flattering mask and calling it liberation. Jung described the persona, the social face we present to the world, constructed from the roles we perform and the expectations we absorb. Not as an enemy, but as a necessary interface between the individual and collective life. The persona is not the problem. The problem is identification with it, the slow, unconscious collapse of the distance between the mask and the man, the face and the person wearing it, until you no longer know you're wearing anything at all. And here is what the authenticity industry does not tell you. When you begin dismantling the persona, when you commit to being real, to showing up as yourself, to dropping the mask, you do not automatically encounter your true nature waiting patiently behind it. You encounter the shadow. The shadow, in Jungian terms, the repository of everything the ego has judged unacceptable, incompatible, or dangerous in itself, is not simply your dark side, your secret cruelties, your suppressed rage. It is also your unlived life. Every path you did not take deposited something into the shadow. not as a loss, but as a presence. Marie-Louise von Franz, in her work on individuation, observed that the unlived life accumulates in the unconscious with a kind of psychic pressure. It does not dissolve. It does not wait patiently. It does not accept the ego's explanations for why it was sacrificed. It persists. It erupts. In the obsessive fantasy about a different life, in the rage that surfaces when someone else lives what you abandoned, in the peculiar grief that attaches itself to strangers' choices as if they were your own. The unlived life is not behind you. It is inside you, pressing outward. Now hold that pressure for a moment, because here is where the descent becomes genuinely uncomfortable. The life you call unlived, the choices you call foregone, the self you call unborn, you did not lose them to circumstance alone. The ego selected against them, carefully, deliberately, because the life that was unlived, the one you mourn in the hour before sleep, would have required the ego to become something it could not control, predict, or narrativize into a coherent identity. It would have required, in the language of Jungian psychology, a confrontation with the self, with a wholeness larger than the ego can manage, a depth wider than the identity can contain. And the ego, your ego, the one reading these words and already preparing its defense, does not survive that confrontation intact. This is what Jung meant when he described individuation not as self-improvement, but as a form of death and rebirth. The ego does not graduate into the self. It surrenders to it. It submits. And the persona, that carefully constructed, authentic identity, is not the path to that surrender. It is the longest, most sophisticated delay of it. The authenticity project, the one you have been running for years, is the ego's most elegant defense mechanism. It gives the ego the feeling of depth without the cost of actual dissolution. It lets you perform the descent without leaving the surface. So what does it mean to actually live the unlived life? Not to chase the fantasy of it, not to construct a newer, truer identity from its ruins, but to actually descend into the psychic material you've been skirting, to let the shadow content rise, to sit with the grief of the abandoned paths without converting that grief into a new story, a new project, a new version of yourself. Jung wrote in Aion that the encounter with the self produces what he called the transcendent function, a symbol, an image, a direction that arises not from the ego's deliberation, but from the tension between consciousness and the unconscious, when that tension is held long enough without a premature resolution. The transcendent function is not a decision. It is not a plan. It is what happens in the psyche when the ego finally stops managing the descent and allows itself to be moved by something it did not author. This is the turn the authenticity industry cannot sell you, because it cannot be packaged, systematized, or assigned as homework. It requires the one thing the ego will resist until the very end: genuine unknowing. The unlived life is not a list of regrets to be processed and released. It is not a vision board of deferred desires. It is the psyche's accumulated insistence that the ego is not the whole story, that beneath every authentic self-presentation, there is a depth the performance cannot reach, a reality the narrative cannot contain. Von Franz wrote that the person who refuses the unconscious, who keeps the unlived life safely sealed behind the glass of their curated identity, does not escape the psyche's demand. They simply ensure it arrives as a crisis rather than an initiation, as a collapse rather than a descent with a map. The hollow feeling you carry, the one that persists after every act of self-actualization, every breakthrough, every period of genuine growth, is not a sign that you have not yet found yourself. It is a sign that you have been finding the wrong thing. The self is not hidden beneath your persona. It is not waiting behind your wounds. It is not the life you did not live. It is the force that has been pressing against the glass all along. The sovereign the ego has been calling a wound, a yearning, a road not taken, trying, with terrifying patience, to be acknowledged as what it actually is. Not the life you lost, the life that is waiting to live you. You have not been searching for yourself. You have been hiding, beautifully, sincerely, with enormous sophistication, from the only thing that was ever real,